Hello, we are ready to read the next chapter. It is titled The Capture, and it's chapter 22. Starts on page 182. I know there isn't a title, so that kind of threw me off when I was reading. I apologize for that. So, The Capture. The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from Giant Country over the years, but he had never in his life made one quite like this. With 9 huge helicopters roaring along just over his head. He had never before traveled in broad daylight either. He hadn't dared to. But this was different. Now he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. They had never seen the likes of it before, and they never would again. Every now and then the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses, crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marveled at the giant's speed and at the way he leapt across wide rivers and over huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. "Be careful to hang on tight," the BFG said. "We's going fast as a thistlecrump." The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forward as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming over the earth like some magical hop, skip, and jumper, with his feet hardly ever touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realized that they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles to full speed, and even then, they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilot. He had a world atlas on his knees, and he kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. "Where the devil are we going?" he cried. "I haven't the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy mustache, and he was very proud of his mustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. "It's fun going new places," he said. "New places?" shouted the head of the Air Force. "What the blazes do you mean, new places?" "This place we're flying over now isn't in the atlas, is it?" the pilot said, grinning. "You're darn right it isn't in the atlas," cried the head of the Air Force. "We've flown clear off the last page." "I expect that old giant knows where he's going," the young pilot said. "He's leading us to disaster," cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him sat the head of the Army, who was even more terrified. "You don't mean to tell me we've gone right out of the atlas?" he cried, leaning forward to look. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," cried the Air Force man. "Look for yourself. Here's the very last map in the whole flamin' atlas. We went off that over an hour ago." He turned the page. As in all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the very end. "So now we must be somewhere here?" he said, putting a finger on one of the blank pages. "Where's here?" cried the head of the Army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, "Well, that's why they always put 2 blank pages at the back of the atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself." The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. "Just look at this godforsaken desert," he cried. "All the trees are dead, and all the rocks are blue." "The giant has stopped," the young pilot said. "He's waving us down." The pilots throttled back the engines, and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered a ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, one from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. "I don't see any giants," the head of the Army said. "The giant is all out, just out of sight over there," the BFG told him. "But if you's taken these slosh-buggling, noisy belly poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once and then pop goes the weasel. So you want us to proceed by jeep? The head of the army said. Yes, the BFG said, but you must all be very, very hush quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery jokery. The BFG, with Sophie still in his ear, trotted forward and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea green in the face. Those are guns, he cried. There's a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, the lot of you. Let's get out of here. Ah, pig spiffle, the BFG said. Those noises is not guns. Of course they're guns, shouted the head of the army. I'm a military man, and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back. Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep, the BFG said. I's a giant myself, and I know a giant snortle when I's hearing one. Are you quite sure? The army man said anxiously. Positive, the BFG said. Proceed cautiously, the army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But then they got close. But then, when they got close, they saw what the giants really looked like. They began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50-feet-long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep. And the sound of their snoring was indeed like gunfire in a battle. The BFG raised a hand and the jeeps all stopped. The soldiers got out. What happens if one of them wakes up? Whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. If any one of them is waking up, he'll gobble you down before you can say knack jive. The BFG answered, grinning hugely. Me's the only one what won't be gobbled up, because giants has never eaten other giants. Me and Sophie's the only safe ones, because I's hiding her if that happens. The head of the army took several paces to the rear. So did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make a fast getaway if necessary. Go forward, men, the head of the army said. Go forward and do your duty bravely. The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains. All of them were trembling mightily. None dared to speak a word. So here they are, coming up on all of these sleeping giants. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood nearby watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained, efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of the 9 giants had been trussed up like chickens and were snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying on his right arm, tucked underneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump eater opened his tiny piggy black eyes. Which one of you foul pesters is wiggling my arm? He bellowed. Is that you, you rotsome man hugger? Suddenly, he saw the soldiers. In a flash, he was sitting up. He looked around him. He saw more soldiers. With a roar, he leapt to his feet. The soldiers, petrified with fear, froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse. Human beings? The flesh lump eater yelled. What's all you flush bunklin' rotsome half-baked beans doing in our country? He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand. I's having early suppers today, he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. There he is, talking about having a nice little snack. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching, horror-struck. Do something, she cried. Put that human being down, the BFG shouted. The flesh lump eater turned and stared at the BFG. What's you doing here with all these grotty twiglets? He bellowed. You's making me very suspicious. The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal, 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm. At the same time, Sophie fell off the BFG's palm and onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch that the queen had pinned on her chest. Quickly she undid it. "I's guzzling you nice and slow," the flesh lump eater was saying to the soldier in his hand. "Then I's guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there. You's not getting away from me, 'cause I's galloping 50 times faster than you." Sophie ran up behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers. When she was right up close to the great, naked, hairy leg, she rammed the 3-inch long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh and stayed there. So she stabbed him with her little brooch. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. "You's bitten by a snake," he shouted. "I seed it biting you. It was a frightsome, poisonous viper. It was a deadly, dangerous vine-skin viper." "Save our souls!" bellowed the flesh lump eater. "Sound the crumpets! I's bitten by a septuous, venomous, vine-skin viper." He flopped onto the ground and sat there, howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. "The teeth of the deadly viper still sticking into me," he yelled. "I's feeling the teeth sticking into my anklet." The BFG saw his second chance. "We must be getting those viper's teeth out at once," he cried. "Otherwise, you's deader than duck soup. I's helping you." The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump eater. "You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands," he ordered. "That'll stop the poisonous juices from the venomous viper going up your leg and into your heart." The flesh lump eater grabbed his ankle with both hands. "Now close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers while I's taking out the teeth of the venomous viper," the BFG said. The terrified flesh lump eater did exactly as he was told. The BFG signaled for some rope, and a soldier rushed it over to him. With both the flesh lump eater's hands gripping his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and hands together with a tight knot. So here he is all tied up now. "I's pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth," the BFG said as he pulled the knot tight. "Do it quickly," shouted the flesh lump eater, "before I's poisoned to death." "There we is," said the BFG, standing up. "You can look now." When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and wriggled, he fought and he figgled, he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was not a thing that he could do. "Well done, you," Sophie cried. "Well done, you," the BFG said, smiling down at the little girl. "You saving all of our lives." "Will you please get that brooch back for me?" Sophie said. "It belongs to the queen." The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during the schismal. "When you's only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you sleep an extra doubly deep," the BFG explained. The heads of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. "Her Majesty will be very pleased with me," the head of the Army said. "I shall probably get a medal. What's the next move?" "Now, you's all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams," the BFG said. "We can't waste our time with that rubbish," the Army general said. "It's the Queen's order," Sophie said. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove across to the BFG's cave, and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars in all to be loaded up, more than 5,000 to each jeep. And it took over an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. "What's that you've got in there?" the head of the Army demanded to know. "Curiosity is killing the rat," the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, "Now, was driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants. The jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters, and the soldiers climbed back on board. But the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were lying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of the engines overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. So here they all are, getting carried away by these helicopters. "I's flush bungled," roared the flesh lump eater. "I is splits wiggled," yelped the child chewer. "I's swog swalloped," bellowed the bone cruncher. "I's goose grungled," howled the man hugger. "I's gonzel swiped," shouted the meat dripper. "I's fluck gungled," screamed the maid masher. "I's slop grobbled," squawked the gizzard gulper, sorry. "I's crodswinkled," yowled the blood bottler. "I's bomp muggered," screeched the butcher boy. The 9 giant carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks on each ends of them were lowered from the front and rear of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giants' chains, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then, very slowly, the giants were winched up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot-long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on powerful searchlights and trained them on the galloping giant so as to keep him in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. Okay, there we go with their plan to capture these giants. Let's see what happens next.